Okay, welcome. So here we are. This is the second video for the midterm, CMP 2800. So let me just make a couple remarks. The focus of this video is to address the questions, the specific exam questions, and go over them and clarify what I'm looking for in response to the questions in a general way, and particularly that you just understand what I'm asking, right? The first video primarily, almost exclusively, deals with the directions for the exam and the expectations for the exam. So I should say that's a generic video that was done in past semesters, and there's a few little tweaks here and there to those instructions based on what you see on your the instructions of your exam paper, right? So what I want to do is just three things. Very briefly look at the Blackboard presentation of where everything is, just so it's unequivocally clear. Then to turn to just a couple reminders and emphasis on certain expectations in terms of the directions. And then we'll get into the questions. And we'll do this as expeditiously as possible. So let's get into what we're going to talk about here. So here we are on our Blackboard page, and just to be clear, you've got the Book of Job, and then you've got the exam right here. You click on it, and let's hope something happens here. So you've got the exam itself with the instructions and the questions. Then you've got rules for writing. I'm not going to look at this in detail, but I have, the grading for the exam consists of two components, the substance and the quality of the writing. And so in the rules for writing, I really focus in on elements of good writing. And good writing is not something mysterious. Good writing is not something kind of intangible. I try to make it as clear as possible, but good writing is not always easy to achieve. And typically good writing involves revising. And the most fundamental principle I can give you in writing is that clear thinking leads to clear writing. Clear thinking leads to clear writing. You have an idea, but when you first write it down, it's not always clear, it's not always coherent, it's not always complete, and it's not perhaps exactly what you want to say. And things you need to understand in writing is that it's very rare that the first time you try to say something that you nail it on the head of exactly what you want to say. And that all starts with a sufficient familiarity with the text and the comprehension of the text. So the more comprehension you have of the text, the more clear you can be in your statements about the text. It's really kind of that simple. And of course, part of it is as you go forward and continue to think on these questions, continue to think on these texts, that your clarity of thinking is enhanced, right? And what that should result in with effort and revision is, further developing and honing what you've written to be more precise and to be more orderly. More precise in terms of saying exactly what you want to say, and more orderly in terms of the organization of it. Because once you know what you want to say, it's going to fall, if you're paying attention to the different points you need or want to make, they're going to fall into a certain logical structure, kind of going from A to B to C to D. And that takes time to see that structure and to see it unfold. Okay, so here it all is. Here is the Turnitin assignment. You click on this, and it gives you a drop-down window. You find your name, and you upload. Or I guess your name is already built in there. I get to drop down for the names. And you upload it. And please make sure that you're using a regular Word document or PDF and not some other strange format that is not going to be accepted by Turnitin. Right? You'll get comprehensive comments back on the Turnitin assignment on top of the grade when that's done. Right? So you will have a clear understanding of why your grade is the way it is when you get it back. Okay, so here's the instructions video. It's all pretty straightforward. So let us now turn to the exam paper itself. So just a reminder, Sunday the 31st by essentially midnight. 12 font. I'd like you to use 1.5 spacing for your answers. That's a spacing that professors don't normally or always ask for. I just find it convenient in terms of the amount of space it uses up and my ability to read it. Double spaced, it just seems to be a waste of paper, a waste of a page, and it takes longer for me to look at, and unnecessarily so. So there's a total of 2 questions, and of course those questions have different parts to them. And so for each question, you need to write between 1.5 pages and 2 pages. And I'm leaving that flexible. If you go a little more than two pages, that's fine too, but it shouldn't be much more. It shouldn't be 3 pages, shouldn't be 5 pages. Part of this assignment is for you to answer these questions within the parameters of 2 pages, within the boundaries of 2 pages. And that means writing as directly and forcefully as possible. And there are many true things that can be said about these texts that are all valid in their own right and accurate to what is said in the text. The question is, what is the question asking you? If what you're saying is not relevant to answering that question, then it shouldn't be in your answer. And that's going to be one strategy by which you hone down what you say to keep it within these limits, because part of the assignment is to write within those limits. It also means in the editing process that you realize maybe either you've been redundant or you've just said something in a much more long-winded way than otherwise could be said, and it can be shortened and so on and so forth. I find when I write that the first time I write something, it's kind of meandering and searching, and it's always longer than it needs to be compared to the final result where I've kind of compressed it down to the essentials. And I think that type of process is common for most writers to have that kind of issue. But the point of view is writing is a process. The first thing you've written, like, the difference essay and diary, among many things, is the diary, you write it cold. You write it once, you don't edit, and it's done. Any type of essay, any type of formal writing, for the most part, unless you're a master writer and can just do all the calculations in your head before anything goes on paper, which is quite a challenge, you're working out what you're given, right? You're working it out, and that means proofreading. So proofreading, absolutely essential. The last thing I want to stress here before we move on to the questions themselves is that essentially what you're doing here in being asked a question is responding. The answer serves as a kind of thesis statement or hypothesis that you then need to support and try to prove. And the 2 ways you do that are by providing evidence and making interpretations. Providing evidence from the text and making interpretations. So when you talk about evidence from the text, the highlighted portion here, you're talking about a quote, a paraphrase, a citing relevant passages, right? And of course, there's 2 ways to cite a text. You can quote it directly or you can paraphrase. In the other video, I talk about what's appropriate when. The key thing is, just like science. If science demands evidence to demonstrate the truth of something, here it's no different. You must demonstrate the truth of what you're saying by producing passages from the text relevant to it. Whether you quote, whether you paraphrase, that has to do with details discussed in the other video. But it's absolutely essential, particularly not just for what I'm asking, but for your grade in general, that you cite the text. And particularly if you call to mind, if you cite a passage, quote it directly, verbatim, you absolutely must explain, interpret, translate what is being said there. And don't assume that the reader knows what it means, because many of the kind of essential passages in these texts are rather elusive, right? It's poetry, which we've said speaks in a figurative way that demands translation and interpretation. Okay, so citing for every part of your answer is absolutely vital. And whether you quote directly or whether you paraphrase, it really depends on the circumstance and the details. One's not better than the other. And let me also just reinforce this. I have here that length is no proof of a good answer. It's not that hard to write a lot of stuff, but it is a challenge to write stuff that's relevant, right? And when you stay focused on answering the question as directly as possible and what is specifically relevant to that question, then you start to, that's what's important. So just writing, or what I call filler, is not going to contribute to your grade. If you have 3 or 4 pages and it's just filler stuff that's not pertaining to these questions, it's not going to help you, right? Because the goal is to have said what you need to say in 2 pages rather than 4 per question. Okay. Let me also just this is important. Obviously, plagiarism is forbidden. That is the verbatim quotation of someone else's writing under the claim that it's yours without properly citing it and putting it in quotation marks. That's forbidden. That results in a failing grade automatically, number 1. Number 2, there is no use of sources other than what's provided to you. These are comprehension questions. This is not a research paper. If you were doing a research paper, citing secondary sources that refer to these primary sources would be entirely appropriate. But this is not the kind of exam that it is. It's not a research paper. It's about your critical thinking. And what do secondary sources do? They interpret for you. And I have given you CAST. That's one exception, but that's something that has been provided for you as a reference to draw on. But there should be no sources drawn on outside of what you've been given. Make that very clear. In the age of the internet and in the age of cut and paste, this has been a problem sometimes. Okay, so the first question, notice the texts that it draws on, right? Genesis, Cass, Milton, and Prometheus. Now, the focus of this is basically the Genesis story as presented in Milton and Genesis. Remember, the story of the fall is only one chapter in Genesis. It's not even a page long, or it's about a page long. It's very short, right? The part of Cass that talks about the fall, it's more chapter 2 than chapter 1, because chapter 1 focuses on the creation, right? And the direct comparison here, this is a compare and contrast between the temptation and the myth of Prometheus. So those are kind of the central texts. But you should, in the course of answering all this, in 2 pages, be able to cite at least once all these sources. And obviously some of them are going to be cited more than that, right? When you make a claim about a text, you need to tell me where that claim is coming from, where in the text you've been able to make that claim, or on what part of the text the claim is based. Okay, so here I give you a kind of general overview, number 1, of what is being asked. So this is a compare and contrast of the temptation and fall in Genesis compared to the myth of the ages and Prometheus's gift of fire and the subsequent punishment that he suffers in the myth of Prometheus. So a lot of the focal point of this question deals with the meaning of the fruit and the fire, right? Compare and contrast the fruit and the fire as symbols, right? And the key thing here is to discuss their literal meanings and their figurative meanings. And it makes sense to discuss their literal meanings first, because their symbolic meanings, their figurative meanings, are really derived from certain features of their literal reality, for lack of a better word, right? And so their physical properties inform their symbolic meaning. And I kind of talk about that in this next part of the question. B, the fruit and the fire symbolize knowledge. Okay, so I don't think that shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. But they symbolize different types of knowledge. What types of knowledge are symbolized in Genesis 3, Milton, and the myth of Prometheus? Compare and contrast these types. Why do I have all 3 listed here? Because the vision of knowledge of the fruit in Genesis is slightly different than what Milton talks about. Milton introduces some of his own elements as to his conception of what the fruit is, right? And they're the same, but he also seems to add things that are not obviously in the original Genesis story. So I want you to address that. We spent a lot of time talking about that in class. And then the myth of Prometheus, in terms of the type of knowledge that the fire and the fruit symbolize. Okay. In both stories, the thing gained by mankind through transgression has to do with reason, intelligence, and a knowledge of some kind. Each story has a moral to tell regarding the value of this knowledge, right? So they gain, and how is the value of this knowledge dictated? Well, one, it's dictated by whether the human beings want it. Prometheus' motivation to steal it in the first place, it's clearly valuable if he wants to steal it. And then the impact of the utilization or the experience of that knowledge has. And so there's pros and cons to the impact, at least certainly in the Genesis story. What is the moral about the role of knowledge relative to human life? Is the knowledge attained considered good or bad within the context of the story, right? And in some case, the answer is one or the other, or in some case, the answer may be more ambiguous than simply good or bad. In both stories, directly or indirectly, there is a prohibition on mankind gaining access to the knowledge and the use of its power. All right, so obviously, let's be clear. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the fruit of it's forbidden, right? And in Prometheus, there is another kind of prohibition, which is to say Zeus tries to prohibit Prometheus from giving this fire to mankind. And it's not just that he's in trouble for having taken the fire, but he's in trouble for having tried to give it and having successfully given it to mankind. Mankind guiding itself through life by the exclusive use of reason appears to be seen as bad, as evidenced in the prohibition. Why do you believe there is this prohibition, and why might using reason alone as a guide to life be considered bad? What are its problems or limitations? Is the prohibition for the benefit of Zeus and the biblical God, or is it for the benefit and well-being of mankind? Why or why not? So the serpent clearly expresses an interpretation of the existence of this prohibition at all, right? He implies that it's God who's benefiting from the prohibition rather than mankind, right? And that's seen both in Milton and also in the original Genesis story. So does the prohibition benefit mankind or does it benefit the gods? Why or why not? Right? So D, out of all the questions we've seen so far, is really the most speculative. It's the most open for you to devise your own thinking. I think this is a challenging question. It's intended to be. And it's really open. It's there for you to be open and think about these issues. Maybe some issues you've not thought about before. And, the goal, I think I said in class, the goal, a good interpretation is one that you can support within the four corners of the text. If you can find evidence in the text for your claims, and you can use that text evidence and reason from it and say, well, I believe it because the text says this, and I think that means this, and so on and so forth. What I'm looking for is competent reasoning and evidence. I'm not looking to judge your interpretation as correct or incorrect, right? That's not the standard by which I'm grading this. So with that, we will be talking about the exam in person next week and clarify any issues you may have. So thank you and good luck. And if you have any further questions, please feel free to get in touch. Thank you.